All right, well, I think we might get started. So, good evening. For those of you that I haven't met, my name's Amanda Kelly and I'm the CEO of Women's Health Goulburn Northeast. So thank you very much for taking the time to celebrate the last 12 months with us and to take a bit of a peek into the future. To start, I'd like to acknowledge that we're intersectional in our approach, and we're proud to stand beside generations of great women whose work has brought us closer to equality for all. I also want to acknowledge the wisdom, living culture and connection to the traditional custodians of the unceded lands on which we're meeting this evening. I want to acknowledge the profound disruption of colonisation and the stolen generations on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And finally, I want to state that we believe in shared and just cultural transformation that embraces our diversity, and these acknowledgements are part of the ethical principles that guide our work and conduct. I'd like to move on to the next section of the evening, which is our panel discussion, which I've been really looking forward to. So as I mentioned in my report earlier, and of course you're all aware, it's been a pretty unique year. And while many of us are looking to write off 2020 and start afresh in 2021, the reality is that there's no clear line. We won't wake up on the 1st of January and find that the world's been reset. So in our region, we're facing the reality of the upcoming fire season. We've not only dealt with fires in the pandemic, but with drought and flood. And through all of this, we still need to milk the cows, grow the crops, school our children, run our businesses, go to work. And rural and regional folk are used to change, more immediately affected by the seasons, more intimately influenced by the changes in weather and the disruption to community because of these changes. The people of the Goulburn and Northeast regions know how to adapt. Women's health's work is to keep working with the local community, local government, health organisations, lawmakers and politicians to make sure that all members of the community have a say in how we respond to these challenges. So now I'd like to introduce you to our panellists to talk about rural resilience. Believe me, I'm going to stop talking in a second. I'm going to introduce and then hand over to some amazing people. So Dr. Kathleen Brasher is a gerontologist with a long involvement in health and community sectors. She's part of the international age-friendly movement as a researcher and advisor to the World Health Organization, governments and NGOs, nationally and overseas. And she's also a member of our own age-friendly Northeast Victoria Alliance. When she's not finding new ways to inspire the world to value growing old, you can find her knitting beanies for her granddaughters or trying to keep rabbits out of the veggie patch. We have Ms. Jenny Godwin. Jenny is a committed advocate for women with disabilities and driver of transformative change in regional communities. Jenny's work has informed and strengthened partnerships that include women of all abilities. Her commitment to equality empowers rural women living with disability and communities to enable access to participation for all. Mr. Paul Ryan is passionate about making positive change happen. He's worked on poverty, climate change, disaster recovery, illegal wildlife trade, domestic violence, regional resilience, water security and infrastructure here and internationally. He's the director of the Australian Resilience Centre, has previously worked for the Stockholm Resilience Centre, CSIRO and government agencies. His proudest achievement to date is making an award-winning Book Week costume for one of his 4 daughters. And finally, but not least, we have Miss Maggie Mackellar. Maggie lives on the east coast of Tasmania. She's the author of 2 books on the history of settlement in Australia and Canada, Core of My Heart, My Country and Strangers in a Foreign Land, and 2 memoirs, When It Rains and How to Get There. So I'd now like to hand over our conversation to our moderator, Kathleen, to chat with you all. So thank you, Kathleen.
Thanks, Amanda. And we're all delighted to be here. And I just need to put in an apology for Maggie. She's had one of those horrendous days with lambing and work, and she is desperately trying to get somewhere with a sound internet connection. So
Can I just say, she just joined the waiting room, so she should be connecting any moment now.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Casey.
No
So welcome everybody. As Amanda has said, Women's Health Goulburn North East has put resilience as its cornerstone. And they're wanting that in both a practical and a strategic way. So Amanda asked us to have a conversation about what that might look like and what that might mean. So, and resilience really is one of the buzzwords of the 2020s. In Scott Morrison's first speech, first formal speech in 2020, after the bushfires, he said that Australia needed to build its resilience for the future. So if we look at what that might mean from a federal government perspective, if we look at their definition of resilience, it's the ability of a system, and I'm reading this so I get it right, it's the ability of a system, community or society exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt, transform and recover in a timely and efficient way. So you always love that little hook at the end. So it's a big definition, and what I'm keen to hear from Paul, Jenny and Maggie is, what does resilience mean for them? What does it look like? Paul, your work, we'll start with you. Your work's been global. How do you know when you're looking at a resilient community or a resilient individual? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, thanks Kathleen, and thanks for the invitation. Thanks to Women's Health Goulburn North East for the fantastic work you do. I mean, when I hear that definition from the federal government, I just kind of have this image of a focus group sitting around coming up with the wording there, and it's just too narrow. It's this emphasis on kind of hazards, and that puts us in a mind of, you know, sort of high-vis vests and flashing lights and traffic cones and things like that, and it's got an emphasis on disruption and getting life back to normal, that there's this notion of bouncing back. And the work that we do cuts across that sort of hazard space. Of course, there's always hazards out there, but there's also those social dimensions that are much more pernicious, I guess. They're slower, deeper, they're more difficult to shift, they grind away at people. So we tend to talk much more about change, just this idea of change, the notion of change, and that change can be fast and slow, it can be anticipated and unanticipated. So we use kind of language like the capacity of people in communities to anticipate and manage and deal with change, both anticipated and unanticipated, and to take and make opportunities for change, you know, to create opportunities themselves. So, and for me, when I see communities that are doing well or recovering well, or when I see communities that are struggling, it's never easy to kind of analyse what the problem is. It's multi-dimensional. It can be the historical evolution of a system that makes them more vulnerable. It can be the makeup of the community, and there's lots of surprises. So we all know about Cyclone Katrina or Hurricane Katrina in the US. You know, one of the worst storms on the planet. The incredible impact on New Orleans, and I was there last year, and we're touring around in areas, and there was areas that still haven't recovered. So that just still vacant blocks and infrastructure that hasn't been repaired, and other areas that look fantastic, and you wouldn't know there'd been any impact. And when you dig into why that is, some communities had the capacity to recover quickly, they had strong connections, they had a particular way of coping. So there's particular ethnic groups, for example, that had very tight social bonds. They recovered quicker than some other areas, things like that. So it's not easy to generalise about what makes a community or a place resilient and not from that outside perspective. It's really, there's some deep dynamics there that we need to understand.
So it's looking at those dynamics, trying not to, as you said, trying not to just overanalyze them, but to understand that there's something about what the community might have been like before, what its strengths were before an event befalls them, and then some mix of things that happens in that capacity to deal with that immediate change, but also the constant change that's happening around.
Yeah, and the type of event matters, and the combination of events. So if we, we've talked a lot about this. I'm involved in a lot of fire recovery stuff at the moment. What would it be like if it had been the other way around? If we'd had COVID first and then the bushfires? And what would the nature of our, recovery look like, and all of that sort of thing? And so the sequence matters as well. The nature of events, the sequence of them, the timing of them, those sorts of things. So, I'm not sort of copping out, but it's too hard in a way to kind of characterise. And so we tend to kind of just put this emphasis more on change, thinking about fast and slow, thinking about things that you're attuned to, that you can anticipate, and things that are really novel. So COVID is extremely novel, and that's thrown everyone from the individual through to whole societies and to globally. It's thrown us off our axis, whereas bushfires are not novel for us. The scale, the speed, all of that stuff, yes, these fires were unprecedented in that regard. But we've had experience, most people living in regional Australia have had these types of events that have happened at least nearby, so we have some familiarity, even if we weren't directly impacted. There's very few people alive that had experience with pandemic, and so those sort of things really come into play as well and really matter.
So, Jenny, what do you think of when you hear the word resilience? What comes to mind for you?
To me, resilience basically is the ability to sort of get back up when there's been setback, the ability to come back. I mean, change is constant, and during life, there is constant change. That's the only thing that we're actually certain of, is that there will be constant change, and there will be a next thing that we'll have to adapt to. So I guess to me, resilience is the ability to adapt to that change without too much, there's always going to be the angst. There's always going to be that, that I guess we all fight change in a way, because familiarity is kind of nice. But resilience to me is that ability to react to change when we have to change. And to do that in a way which is, I guess, smoother, rather than, really crushing and bashing and lots of falling down and all the rest of it. So I guess, to me, that ability to change in a more seamless way.
So it's an individual strength, if you like, or a trait that we can have that helps us more quickly adapt to whatever change comes our way. So it has a more individual feel to it.
Yes, and that's the thing. I mean, as individuals, if we can adapt and can sort of go with the changes and I guess go with that flow of moving with whatever direction life is actually taking us, because that's something that we generally, or quite often, can't actually control.
Yes, that's right.
So,
Maggie, thanks for joining us. So Paul's got that very global view, that very sense of those big shifts that happen for a whole lot of reasons. And Jenny's given this much more some subtle and individual approach. When you think of resilience, what comes to mind for you? Where does your thoughts take you?
Did you catch any of that?
No, start again. Off you go.
I said thank you for having me, everyone, and sorry for being late. And I'm coming to you from the side of the road because my day went pear-shaped. And it was fascinating listening to Paul sort of pin down a sort of a macro view of resilience and how that works on, as you said, on a global scale, and then to hear Jenny's reflections on that as well. And as they were talking, I was thinking about, well, how do I think about resilience? And obviously and I thought for me, it was it's a personal word, and it's something that I felt that I needed to do. I didn't necessarily think about it in terms of myself, but it was something that I wanted to pass on to my children and to teach them how to be resilient. And it was kind of like when our lives went pear-shaped on a personal level, like when tragedy sort of came out of, which is often the time where people have to find the skills that we define as resilient. I felt really determined that my role as a mother was to teach my children that they had the capacity within them to define themselves not by tragedy, but by who they were within themselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's not that you are the thing that happened to you, but you are the person that responds to that. It's
and that you can develop the skills to do that.
That's what I was just going to draw on for you, that there's a bunch of skills that can be taught as a parent, and perhaps we can talk about as colleagues or as organizations. You know, how do we pass on, what are those bucket of skills? Where do we turn to? So when you were thinking about that as a quality you wanted your children to have, what did you do to teach them? Can you think about what it was that you turned to?
I had to let them fail. That was something that was really hard to do when you've got a vulnerable child, when you know they've suffered a lot more than their peers have, when they know that life ends and that you just don't want anything bad to ever happen to them again. And yet, in order for them to develop their sense of self, I had to step back and let them not succeed at things. And that was really, I thought that was, and connecting to the community is one way of doing that, through sport and through music and through school and all of those things. And so that was that was something that I really allowed them to, I had to stand back and watch and be there to pick the pieces up, but just to allow them to fail.
Yeah. Paul, if you think about, Maggie's idea that there's this bunch of skills that we can teach, and that part of that is teaching when things go wrong. How does that apply to work with organisations, or in the sort of work you do? Do you look at those times when things have gone wrong to say what was needed to adapt to the change that going wrong brought? Because it's a part of that change that we spoke about.
Yeah, I mean, I love what Maggie just said. It was beautifully articulated, and that idea of protection, trying to protect your children, which is our natural instinct, but actually recognising the fact that they need a certain level of stress or distress to learn. It's the same for organisations. It's the same for communities. You can't stop a lot of the changes, and your capacity will be exceeded at times. So having an organisation that's focused on never failing or never going through rough patches is just not the right way to think about it. And instead thinking about the fact that there are these kind of cycles of change that happen in organisations and in our own lives, where you have periods of stability and things go well and everything's lined up and it feels great. And then you have these periods of turbulence, and just one thing is to accept that will happen. You can never keep things in the sweet spot for very long. They will get there. You will work very hard to get them there, but they don't stay there very long. Something will change. And then recognising that actually those periods of turbulence and instability are also fantastic times of growth. They create new opportunities. You know, the turnover of leadership and things like that are often seen as a kind of tragedy or whatever, but they're also these periods of incredible release and breaking apart. And you get, we call it creative destruction. You get these periods of you know, massive change and evolution. And I remember talking to a farmer, a really, you know, very good operator just not so long ago, who said the best thing that ever happened to me was the millennium drought. And he said it shook me out of this period of 20 or 30 years of just doing the same thing, and suddenly I was challenged to the very core, fundamentally changed his business and was far more successful than he's ever been. And he said, I put it down to the drought. It was you know, and I think organisations are the same, that we look at trying to set up organisations that will be constant with a certain level of funding and a certain level of staff. And I think it's actually, you know, setting ourselves up for failure and disappointment. I think we should set our organisations up to be able to just cope with the boom and bust, and to accept the fact that they'll grow and shrink at different times. You need some level of core capacity in organisations to keep going, of course, for them to stay as an organisation, you know, of course, but this idea that they should be fixed in a certain size and shape and operate in a certain way, I think just doesn't suit the world that we operate in. And so I tend to talk with people about what are those core flexibilities, and where can you be flexible, and what are the things that actually are non-negotiables that we need to carry through. And so and also talking to people about the fact that it's okay for organisations to fail. You know, it's really hard to run an organisation and keep an organisation functioning. And so I think when people see an organisation that's dying, they have all of this kind of, you know, grief about the fact that they've let down the organisation or the people they work with. I'm far more, you know, kind of, you know, just philosophical about it. Things live and die, including organisations.
I mean, it's that other big buzzword that we always get is from all sorts of people is sustainability. You know, we want the organisation to be sustainable. We want this project to be sustainable. And your notion of creative destruction, it's like, oh, that's a big word, destruction. But it brought to mind Richard Sennett, who's a sociologist who writes a lot about cities and buildings, and so his latest book, he describes resilience as the ability to repair something. So he says that you can either repair something through restoring it, trying to get it back perfectly the way it was before. So, you know, let's go back to a perfect Australia, whenever that was, and let's return to that. Or you can repair it through remediation. So you can use new ideas, but you're still going to have the same, you still want the same thing. Or you repair it through reforming, through reconfiguring. So you make it something completely different and new. And is that a bit like what creative destruction is aiming to do? So to hold on to the elements that are there, whether they're physical elements, not wasting resources, using resources carefully, or whether it's something about the qualities of what was happening that we wanted to keep.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of really good things there. One is, I mean, it's not my idea, creative destruction. It's been around for a long time. Schumpeter came from Schumpeter as an economist, but the idea that there should be this kind of efficiency in systems is, you know, I think that's not the right way to think about it. There's times when you should actually be inefficient, because that's where you get a lot of reflection and you get a lot of innovation, people trying different things, all of that sort of stuff. And you need periods of this creative destruction, if you like, to also destroy some of the things that, or, you know, destroy is a strong word, but to break apart some of the bonds, you know, that we get caught in ideas, we do it in ourselves, we do it in our organisations, we get into patterns of behaviour and thinking, and we actually need this disturbance to break those apart so that you can have a fresh look at things and put them back together in different ways. So that idea of repair, I think, it's an important one, and how you do repair. So the notion of putting something back exactly as it was is, so I come from a sort of complex systems thinking world, and we live in complex systems. Our society, our economy, etc., are complex systems. There's one really important rule about complex systems: they only go forward.
Yeah.
They only go forward, you know, so we can never, ever go back to where we were yesterday because every tick of the clock, things are slightly different. You know, we're all a little bit older, we're all a little bit sicker, we're all a little bit healthier, we're all a little bit whatever. Our economy is a bit, you know, has changed, our resources have changed, our et cetera, complex systems only go forward. And it's a really simple idea, but it's a really important one.
Yeah.
So many people are fixated on turning the clock back. You know, if we just get it back to here, everything will be okay. It's an anathema. It just simply cannot be. So, and that's a hard message for some people. You know, my dad would like to live, you know, wind the clock to 1950 sort of thing, and it's not going to happen.
No. We've avoided the other part of the phrase that we were given to talk about, and that's the word rural. So, Jenny, when you talk about that ability to get moving as an individual to sort of somehow seamlessly, or more seamlessly, it's impossible to be seamless, and I don't think you meant that, respond to those changes. What matters about that in a rural setting? What does it mean to be in a rural community as an individual coming to terms with that change?
I guess to me, a rural, I define the rural area. I mean, it's complex. It can be small, it can be large, it can be outback, it can be, you know, regional, etc. But to me, the one thing about it is the community looks out for each other. And I guess in a rural setting, that's sort of something that we have in mind, is that we know each other. I guess that's the beginning of it. We actually know more people within our own communities. So I guess in a rural setting, we have a tighter community. We know the people, we look out for the people, and I guess that makes things more inclusive. Because if we actually, you know that somebody might be in trouble and we're looking out for them, then that actually brings a community resilience, because it's more personal, it's more connected, it's through that, just that intimate knowledge of who your neighbour is, who's down the road, rather than, you know, you might see somebody on a tram or a train in Melbourne, but, you know, you really don't know who those people are. Whereas in our communities, being smaller, as I said, it doesn't matter whether that's a regional area or a larger regional area like Goulburn, or a smaller, you know, just a little town. We actually know those people, and have a connectedness to them.
Yeah. Maggie, how much does place matter, and for that to be a rural place, in that desire to nurture skills of resilience in young people and in ourselves?
Yeah, I think, oh, am I unmuted?
No, you're right, off you go.
Yeah, I think sense of place or a belonging is really important, and it's one of the I think the advantages of living in rural communities is often that there is a very strong sense of place, and that's developed on an individual basis, I think, as well. I guess historically, I studied a lot of women who were moving onto the frontiers of the New World and in Australia and Canada, and I looked at what particular set of skills made a difference as to whether they developed a sense of belonging and therefore felt part of the community, and therefore adapted to their new role in a new place. And one of those really important things seemed to me to be movement. It seemed to me to be something about being able to move beyond your own household, like beyond your own garden gate. And so I guess it speaks very directly to what Jenny was talking about, and saying that rural communities have a sort of a superpower, really, that they do know they do know who Mrs. Castle is down the road and how old she is and her 5 daughters, and all the different connections, I think, are really important to a community's well-being, and also to supporting themselves. And
so for
in
those,
the historic,
those women that you studied, was it that ability to move out of their small, the home that they were trying to build, the physical house, into this extraordinary new place, if they're actually out in those frontiers? So what skills did they need to get out the door?
They needed curiosity.
Yeah.
They needed curiosity. They needed openness. They also needed really practical skills of being able to ride a horse or drive a buggy, not rely on, have to rely on a man, a husband, a brother, an uncle, a son to drive them or take them somewhere. So I think these really basic things are sometimes things we overlook in even today, because I think the ability to get into our space, get into nature. I mean, that's the other thing about living in a rural community. We are so lucky that we are able to go to a place that kind of repairs us at a really basic level, in a way that sometimes we don't even acknowledge, because it's not seen as important, though it's increasingly being recognised. So yeah, that's what I mean by it was a really stark contrast between those women that were able to have a sense of movement outside of their domestic sphere, and therefore connection into the place that they lived and the people that they lived within.
So they were able to connect with that place in a way that the women who were not able to accept that new space, get out, live it, hold it, and work in it. Oh.
And just on a personal level, like I was just reflecting on why I moved from a big city back to a rural community when my children were very young. And that was a very healing thing for me to do, partly because I had a strong sense of place there, but also because people were not as afraid to get involved. I found in the urban place I was living that everyone retreated to their houses, but when you'd see people at the school gate and at school drop-off or whatever, and they'd say, "How are you?" And it was too easy to put a front on, it was too easy to brush off people's inquiries. But I was really struck by the fact that when I moved into a very small rural community, people were willing to step into the gaps in my life and help in ways that were uncomfortable, perhaps, on in a more urban setting. Yeah. That's a helpful reflection.
No, it was, because it's that sense, again, Paul, you spoke about that you almost need the crisis, and I always hate that. I want to be a better person without having to experience heartache or struggle, and Maggie's spoken about that too. But how do you see place helping those things? How is place almost part of that bucket of skills we need to develop resilience? It's
just fundamental. I mean, we are a local place-based species. We, for 4 million years, we've evolved in place. It's only been in the last generation that we've moved around a lot, and so we're essentially still a place-based species. I like the idea of we're kind of just apes with broadband, really, and and we now move around. The last generation has started to move a lot more. So up until a generation ago, there was a study done in the UK. The vast majority of people live within 5 miles of where they were born. For us, it's probably a bit more because, distances, etc. But most of us are, place-based still. And, Jenny's and Maggie's articulation of this intimacy of place, and that we just don't have the cognitive machinery to live in big places. You know, we just don't have it. We are, there's that, you know, what the Dunbar's number, I think it's called, you know, that we can only cope with a set number of relationships, maybe 150 people that we can know and trust, maybe a few more. So intimacy, and this notion of kind of intimacy, and Maggie's, you know, beautiful articulation of stepping into the gaps and those sort of things, can only come from people that you know and trust in place, who observe you in different settings and all of that. And I've been doing some work with, you know, farmers in New South Wales on post-drought, and it was just such a privilege to be part of a conversation one day where they started to talk about a lady who lived, whose partner had died, and she still lived on a remote property on her own, and she was very worried being there on her own. So she had 3 lock gates between the road and the house. And there was only one person who knew where the key was, and he was the next door neighbour, and he was an interstate truckie. So the issue was, we know there's this lady living there that if something happens, you know, no one's got a hope of getting to the house. So then set off a conversation about the whole community, about who lives over a bridge that floods quickly, who, you know, which bridge can handle a big CFA tanker and which one can handle a small CFA, you know, mobile unit. You know, who's got, you know, mobility, disability, you know, challenges, all of those sorts of things, or disabilities, who has mobile coverage, and they just started drawing it on maps and mapping it. And I've done lots of sort of vulnerability, you know, formal kind of vulnerability mapping, and this was something totally different, and it was a map of kind of intimacy of, you know, that you can only get from people that know and care for each other in a way that, you know, you just can't get in bigger population centres. And so, you know, place is absolutely fundamental. It's critical to thinking about resilience. And another thing, just quickly, another thing we do in the workshops we run is I ask people, when they've been away from their place for holidays or work or whatever, and they're coming back, I get them to close their eyes, take a deep breath, and picture this in their mind. How do you know when you're home? And the nuance that people, you know, no one has ever said, oh, when I drive across the local government boundary. You know, it's this nuanced, sophisticated expression of topography. It comes up usually first, but soil type, I'm on the black soil plains, or I'm back in the red country, or they talk about vegetation types and tree species. They talk about the light, the smell. And so we are so intimately connected that in ways that we don't even know until someone draws your attention to it. So I you know, I mean, it's a passion of mine is to understand that connection between people and place, because it drives us, it holds us in place. It also stops us from changing too, because we want the snapshot to stay the same. And you know, places don't stay the same. And particularly under a changing climate, many of the things that we value are changing rapidly, and so they will sound different. Our places will sound different, they will feel different, and so that's a process that we're going to go through as a society, about the adjustment to a changing climate and the importance of that.
In the last few minutes we've got, I want to raise just one more issue, and we've all touched on it as we've talked, that we are living with constant change. It is the bread and butter of modernity. That's what the modern life is all about. And I am going to quote Karl Marx. I wasn't sure whether I would, but he wrote in 1849 that all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relationships with his kind. So I take that to mean that in that constant change, we have to face what we're doing to our planet, the conditions that we live in on a daily basis, that change that the three of you have spoken about, you know, the one damn thing after another that I have to deal with, and that is in relationship with the other, with our community, with the intimacy that Maggie described. So we've got this situation of having to make choices and decisions, one thing after another, after another, and after another. And then we've got this weird time where the measure of global freedom is showing that we're now in our 13th consecutive year of a decline of freedom. So we've got this rise of authoritarianism. And there's some thought that part of what that is people handing over their freedom to choose, because it's so bloody hard. That in that constant change, in that constant demand, you know, Dostoevsky, I'll badly quote him, you know, said that people would rather death than having to choose with the knowledge of good and evil. So I'm wondering, is that where resilience resides? In that space where you have to make a choice about how you manage to put your garbage out, to look after the planet, how you know, do you go to work today? Like simple choices as well as the big choices, who you vote for, how we decide on policy. So I'm interested in your thoughts on how we create that space, or is that the skill, what are the skills we need to help us when we're feeling so overwhelmed and we need to care for our planet differently, we need to care for the people differently? You know, is that where we need to cultivate resilience, and what might that look like? And Maggie, I'll start with you this time. Have we lost her?
Bugger.
Oh, there we go.
Muted again. I was just saying that you have beautifully articulated this moment that we find ourselves in time where suddenly we are local again. And I think that these huge global crises are happening to us at a really local level, and that we are now being forced to respond locally. And I'm not sure how much this, and hopefully Paul can speak more direct to the more macro level, but I keep thinking of this metaphor. I walk on the beach every day down here on the east coast of Tasmania on this deserted beach that's just off our property. And it changes all year. Like, it's never the same beach. It's always, but there are things that are constant in it. And I was kind of like thinking about how we have to be open to being broken. We have to be open to being to accepting the constant brokenness of our world in order to move forward. And and so I think that that's something that I'm trying really hard personally to accept, that that there's a brokenness that is powerful, and we're being forced to confront that on a kind of global level because the world's broken. The world that we knew it is broken.
Jenny, what in that localness, is that where you find that capacity to cope with the next thing, to be that resilient person?
It is, at the moment, times are very challenging, times are very, very changed, and times are very unfamiliar at the moment. And I think that connectedness, that small community connectedness that we're looking at the moment, that is actually being really, really helpful. And we're connecting more at a one-to-one level rather than just people that meet along the way and really don't say much. I mean, we have the same sort of conversations and all the rest of it. But now we're connecting again on a much more intimate level because we're speaking more one-to-one, by telephone, by Zoom, whatever. So we're actually getting to know each other in a different way, and I think that is actually quite comforting at the moment. And that's probably something that's been most interesting to me at the moment with the whole COVID thing, has been how that in amongst those really, really big changes, there's actually been parts which have been quite nice. I've met people that I've worked with that I had no idea that I've worked with them, you know. I'm finding out what their jobs are, but I didn't know that their jobs were actually there. So I guess, you know, in amongst times of disaster and times of big change, which we're having to get more used to, there is also some things which are quite good and are also still quite comforting, which makes it not quite so distressing as well.
Yeah, okay. Paul, how do we cultivate that space in the overwhelmingness of those both big decisions, small decisions? How do we maintain an ability to choose in the face of those things, I guess?
Yeah, good question. Kathleen, I want to just pick up on a comment that Bern made in the chat, which is around there's a lot to learn from First Nations people. So all around the planet, there's groups of people that have consistently been able to meet challenges and continue on. And I think that's a really great
60,000 years.
It's a great message. Thanks, Bern, for making that. One thing I'd go back to is just that there's the values work done by Swartz. They interviewed 60,000 people across 60 countries, and the number one value that comes out consistently cross-culturally across 60 different countries is benevolence. And so which is care for others essentially. And so people care, and one of the biases that we have is that we believe that other people don't care as much as us, and that's not true.
No.
And we need to challenge that. We need to constantly challenge ourselves about that bias. People care, and so to me that's the starting point, and our challenge, I think, is to actually activate those values in a positive way, and we see it all the time. We see it during disasters, and Jenny beautifully articulated that about the connection between people now when we're under stress and the challenges with COVID. How do we get that? How do we get more of that? When we shouldn't have to wait for the disaster. Actually, people care and people want to connect. And a powerful thing which does come from a lot from First Nations people too is just reciprocity. If you do something for people, they'll do something back, and that ties us together in a positive way. We're not doing it in a way to get, when you do something, you're not doing it and get something back, but you do get something back. You get, there's all the research about volunteers live longer, they're happier, they're better connected, they're healthier people. There's a good reason for that, because when you do it, it feels really good. So I think there's some really basic things that we can do. One is to think about the fact that other people care as much as us. We just need to start the conversation with them, and doing something for someone else starts off a process that keeps rolling. And we've seen it again and again, that just, all around the world in different ways, that doing something for someone else kicks off, it catalyses a ripple that just starts and goes out. And I think we just need to keep doing some of those things.
Terrific. That's a lovely place to end. So I really want to thank Paul, Jenny and Maggie for their contribution tonight. It was just terrific. So thank you very much. So over to you, Amanda.
Thank you, Kathleen. And so thank you very much, Paul, Jenny and Maggie for the conversation, and Kathleen for leading it so beautifully. So thank you all. Thank you particularly to our panellists for the time, and I know that you spent time preparing for this. There's some really lovely comments in the chat there around the things that you've been talking about, and I do feel like this is part of our resilience, getting together and having these conversations and reflecting is a really key part of it. So it's lovely to do that, and it's lovely to do it with all of you. There are some familiar faces and names, and some new faces and names, and it's so lovely to have you here. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you spending your Thursday evening with us, and I wish you all the best. I thank you all for this, and I want to say good night now. So thank you all very much, and good night.